Every time I stayed over at my fiancé's parents' lake house in Door County, I'd wake up the next morning with my contact lenses still in, my eyes burning, and absolutely no memory of going to bed. My fiancé just told me I'd had too much wine. The problem was, I never drank more than one glass. My name is Renata, and I am 29 years old. I work as a digital forensics investigator for a regional bank in Chicago, the kind of job where I spend my days untangling wire fraud and laundering schemes that look perfectly clean on the surface until you know exactly where to dig. I tell people it's boring work. It is not boring work. It teaches you to notice when something doesn't add up, and it teaches you to never trust a balance sheet just because it's printed on nice paper. I should have applied that lesson to my own life a lot sooner than I did. I met Asher Whitlock at a charity gala 18 months ago. He was warm in a way that felt effortless, the kind of man who remembered the name of the bartender and asked about her kids. He came from money, old Wisconsin money, the kind that builds hospital wings and gets streets named after great-grandfathers. I came from a 2-bedroom apartment in Cicero where my mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry so I could go to community college before transferring to a 4-year school on scholarships and loans I'm still paying off. Asher never once made me feel small for that. His family, on the other hand, made sure I knew exactly where I stood every single time I walked through their door. His mother, Genevieve, had a way of asking questions that sounded like compliments and landed like accusations. "You're so resourceful, Renata, figuring out how to make ends meet on a salary like yours." His father, Holt, mostly ignored me unless he needed someone to agree with him about politics. His older brother, the one who managed the family's investment trust, was the only one who ever looked at me like I was an actual threat instead of a charity case Asher had brought home. His name was Garrison, and something about the way he watched me across the dinner table always made the hair on my arms stand up, even before I had a single reason to distrust him. The lake house was where the Whitlocks did their real entertaining, away from the city, away from witnesses who weren't already part of the family. We went up most weekends from May through October. Genevieve called it family bonding. I called it, privately, an audition I never seemed to pass no matter how well I performed. It started in June. We'd had dinner on the screened porch, grilled whitefish, and a salad Genevieve made a point of telling me was very simple, very affordable. And I had exactly one glass of Sauvignon Blanc because I was driving back to the city early the next morning for a deposition. I remember laughing at something Holt said about the bears. I remember Asher's hand on my knee under the table. And then I remember almost nothing else until I woke up on top of the covers in the guest room at 6 in the morning, fully dressed, my mouth so dry it felt lined with sand, and a headache pressing behind my eyes like someone had reached into my skulls and squeezed. I told myself it was the wine. Except it wasn't. I know what one glass of wine does to me, and it is not that. It happened again 3 weeks later, and then again in August. Each time, the same pattern, a feeling of heaviness creeping over me sometime after dinner, a fog settling behind my eyes, and then waking up hours later with no memory of how I'd gotten to bed, my body aching in ways that didn't match a night of simply falling asleep on a couch. Once I woke up with my blouse buttoned wrong, 2 buttons off, so the collar sat crooked against my collarbone. Once my purse, which I always kept zipped, was sitting open on the nightstand with my wallet visibly disturbed, though nothing appeared to be missing. Asher kept telling me I just wasn't used to drinking at altitude, which made no sense because Door County is not exactly the Rockies, and I told him so. He'd laugh it off, kiss my forehead, tell me I worked too hard and needed to relax more when we were up there. I wanted so badly to believe him. I loved him. I still do, if I'm honest, even now, even after everything. But loving someone and trusting their family blindly are two very different things, and my job had spent 6 years training me to notice exactly the kind of inconsistency I was living inside of every weekend. So in September, I started paying attention the way I would on a case file. I noticed that the heaviness only ever set in after Genevieve personally poured my second glass of water, the one she always insisted on refilling herself, hovering at my elbow with the pitcher like a flight attendant. I noticed that Garrison disappeared from the table almost every time it happened, citing a work call, always gone for exactly the length of time it took me to go under. I noticed that my work laptop, the one with 3 layers of encrypted bank security on it, always seemed to have been moved an inch from where I'd left it. The screen angle slightly different, though it was always locked when I checked it the next morning. That last detail was the one that actually scared me. Because my laptop didn't unlock with a password anymore. 6 weeks earlier, after a security breach scare at the bank, IT had switched my entire team over to facial recognition login, mandatory, no exceptions, tied directly to our compliance systems. There was no password to steal. The only way into that laptop was my face, looking directly at the camera, eyes open. I sat with that fact for 2 days before I let myself fully understand what it meant. Someone in that house needed me unconscious, but not too unconscious. They needed my eyes open. They needed my face angled toward a screen. I thought about going to the police immediately, but I knew exactly how that conversation would go without proof. A drowsy feeling after dinner, a crooked button, a laptop that looked slightly moved. None of it was a crime on paper. I needed something a detective couldn't argue with, and 6 years of forensic work had taught me that you don't confront a fraud, you document it first, quietly, completely, and only then do you move. So I went back to the lake house in October with a plan. I bought a small audio recorder, the kind realtors use for walkthroughs, no bigger than a tube of lipstick, and I tucked it into the seam of the guest room curtains, where the fabric pooled on the floor, pointed toward the desk where my laptop sat charging every night. I also did something I'd been too embarrassed to do before. I asked my coworker Priya from compliance. No, I caught myself. I never told a soul outside that house what I suspected, not even my closest friend, because if I was wrong, if I was about to accuse Asher's family of drugging me to steal bank data, I needed to be completely certain before I said a word to anyone. That weekend, dinner went exactly the way it always did. Genevieve hovered with the water pitcher. Garrison excused himself around 9 to take a call from New York. I drank exactly half a glass of water from that second pour, and then, the moment Genevieve's back was turned, poured the rest into the potted fern by the porch door. I made a show of yawning, of being tired from the work week, of saying goodnight earlier than usual. I went up to the guest room, slid the recorder fully into place, climbed into bed in my clothes, and lay there in the dark with my eyes closed, my heart slamming against my ribs, pretending with everything I had to be a woman falling into a drugged sleep. 40 minutes later, I heard the door open. I kept my breathing slow and even, the way I'd practiced in front of my bathroom mirror 2 nights before, feeling ridiculous and terrified at the same time. Footsteps crossed the carpet. I felt someone's hand brush my shoulder, testing whether I'd respond. I didn't move. A set of footsteps joined the first. "She's out," Garrison's voice said, low, almost bored, like this was routine. "Genevieve only gave her the half dose tonight. She'll be under for at least 20 minutes. That's enough time," a third voice answered, and my stomach dropped because it wasn't Holt's voice. It was unfamiliar, clipped, professional in a way that didn't belong in a family lake house at 10 at night. "Sit her up against the headboard. We need the angle right or the recognition software throws an error." I felt hands under my arms, lifting me, propping me against the pillows. Someone tilted my chin upward. I kept my eyes shut, every muscle in my body screaming at me to fight, to run, while I forced myself to stay limp and breathe like I was 1,000 miles away in a dreamless sleep. "Eyes," the stranger's voice said, impatient now. "I need her eyes open for the scan, just for 2 seconds, that's all it takes." I felt fingers at my eyelid, peeling it back, and I understood in that single moment exactly how far these people were willing to go, and exactly how much danger I was actually in, lying in a house an hour and a half from the city, surrounded by people who clearly did this often enough to have a routine and a hired specialist on call. The recognition scan apparently failed, because the stranger swore under his breath and said they'd need a few more minutes for the drug to settle properly, that they'd come back. I heard the door close. I lay there in the dark for what felt like an hour, though it was probably closer to 10 minutes, before I finally let myself open my eyes, shaking so hard I had to grip the headboard to keep from making noise. I did not wait around for round 2. I got up, moving as quietly as I have ever moved in my life, retrieved the recorder from the curtain seam, grabbed my phone, my purse, and my laptop, and I climbed out through the guest room window onto the lower roof of the porch. The same roof I'd noticed back in June had a trellis running down to the yard, the kind of detail you only notice when some part of you has already started preparing an exit strategy without telling the rest of you. I drove back to Chicago that night, going 85 down a dark county highway, checking my mirrors every 30 seconds, certain someone was going to come after me. I did not confront Asher, not yet. I knew exactly what showing my hand too early would cost me, because I'd read enough fraud case files to know that the moment a target realizes they've been caught, the first thing they do is destroy evidence and lawyer up. Instead, the next morning, I drove straight to an urgent care clinic and asked for a full toxicology panel, telling the doctor honestly that I suspected I'd been drugged without my knowledge. The blood work came back showing trace levels of a sedative commonly used in anesthesia, the kind that's nearly undetectable after 12 hours, unless you specifically test for it. I had it. I had it on paper, dated, time-stamped, signed by a physician. Then I called my supervisor at the bank, not to report a crime yet, but to ask, in vague hypothetical terms, what would happen if someone's secure laptop had been accessed by an unauthorized party using facial recognition spoofing. She put me in touch with our internal security team within the hour. They pulled the access logs from my laptop remotely and found 3 failed login attempts on 3 separate weekends in June, July, and August, each one occurring between 10 and 11 at night, each one originating from the device's own camera trying and failing to authenticate a face that wasn't mine closely enough. I had the medical records, I had the access logs, I had a recording of a man with a stranger's voice talking about doses and recognition software in my fiancé's family's guest room. What I did not yet have was why, and that question kept me up more than the fear did. The Whitlocks did not need my salary. They had more money than I would make in 10 lifetimes. So what exactly was on a forensic fraud investigator's laptop that was worth this much risk? I found the answer 2 days later, and it came from the last place I expected. Holt himself, Asher's father, who called me out of the blue and asked if we could have lunch, just the 2 of us, no Genevieve. I almost said no. Then I remembered that good investigators don't turn down a source just because the source makes them uneasy. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, and Holt, 3 glasses of scotch into the afternoon, told me everything he probably shouldn't have. The Whitlock Family Trust, the one Garrison managed, was not the fortress of old money it appeared to be. Garrison had spent the better part of 4 years quietly siphoning funds into a series of shell investments that had collapsed during a downturn 18 months earlier, and he'd been covering the losses by forging quarterly statements that the family's outside auditors had started asking pointed questions about. My bank, it turned out, held one of the trust's primary accounts, and the audit trail Garrison was desperate to bury lived partially on systems I had access to as part of an unrelated compliance review I'd mentioned once, casually, at a dinner 8 months earlier, never imagining anyone at that table was listening that closely. Garrison needed into my laptop not for my money, but to find and quietly alter records that would expose 4 years of theft from his own family's trust before the external auditors found them first. Genevieve, it turned out, knew exactly what was happening and had decided protecting the family name was worth drugging her future daughter-in-law on a near-monthly basis. Holt swore up and down he hadn't known the details, only that something was being handled. I believed about half of that. I didn't go to the police that week. I went to my own bank's general counsel first, because I needed the institutional weight of fraud counsel behind me before I walked into anything, and because I knew that once I made this public, the Whitlock's lawyers moved fast and hard to discredit me. We built the case properly over the following month. The medical toxicology report, the laptop access logs cross-referenced with the failed facial recognition timestamps, the audio recording, and eventually, with a forensic accountant's quiet thoroughness that I recognized in myself, a full trace of the shell investments Garrison had used to bury the trust's losses. The confrontation happened the way I wanted it to happen, not in a dark guest room with my eyes closed, but in broad daylight at the engagement party Genevieve had been planning for months, in front of every single person whose opinion she had spent 2 years using as a weapon against me. I stood up during the toast, my own toast, the one she'd asked me to give about family, and instead I played 11 seconds of the recording through a small speaker I'd set in my clutch, just enough for the room to hear a stranger's voice say "eyes" and Garrison's voice say "she's out." Then I told them, calmly, the way I'd give testimony in a deposition, exactly what had happened to me on 3 separate weekends at their lake house, and exactly what the bank's forensic team and the county sheriff's office, who I'd already briefed that morning, were prepared to do about it. I watched Garrison's face go the color of old paper. I watched Genevieve reach for a chair to steady herself. I watched Asher, my fiancé, the man I genuinely loved, look at his own family with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of grief and fury and a kind of recognition, like watching a building you grew up in finally show you the cracks that were always there. The county sheriff's office arrested Garrison 2 weeks later on charges of fraud and unlawful surveillance, with the drugging charges still under investigation by the district attorney once my toxicology evidence was formally entered. Genevieve was charged as an accessory. The specialist turned out to be a private security contractor Garrison had been paying in cash. The kind of man who does this work for families desperate enough to pay for it, and arrogant enough to think they'll never get caught. Asher did not defend his mother. He did not defend his brother. He showed up at my apartment 3 days after the engagement party with a duffel bag, the recording still playing in both our heads, and told me that whatever happened next, he wasn't going back to that house, and he wasn't going to pretend any of it had been normal. I told him I needed time, and he gave it to me, which, more than anything else he could have said, was the thing that made me believe him. It has been 4 months. The criminal case is still moving through the courts. I sleep with my laptop in a locked drawer now, more out of habit than necessity. Asher and I are still together, slower than before, more honest than before, building something neither of us is in a hurry to rush. I still drink water at dinner, I just pour it myself.